Mary Shelley's Preface to Percy Shelley's Poems, First Edition, 1839. Obstacles have long existed of my presenting the public with a perfect edition of Shelley's poems. These being at last happily removed, I hasten to fulfill an important duty, that of giving the productions of a sublime genius to the world, with all the correctness possible, and of, at the same time, detailing the history of those productions as they sprang, living and warm, from his heart and brain. I abstain from any remark on the occurrences of his private life, except inasmuch as the passions which they engendered inspired his poetry. This is not the first time to relate the truth, and I should reject any coloring of the truth. No account of these events has ever been given all approaching reality in their details, either as regards himself or others, nor shall I further allude to them than to remark that the errors of action committed by man as noble and generous as Shelley may, as far as he only is concerned, be fearlessly avowed by those who loved him, in the firm conviction that, were they judged impartially, his character would stand in fairer and brighter light than that of any contemporary. Whatever faults he had ought to find extenuation among his fellows, since they proved him to be human. Without them, the exalted nature of his soul would have raised him into something divine. The qualities that struck anyone newly introduced to Shelley were, first, a gentle and cordial goodness that animated his intercourse with warm affection and helpful sympathy. The other, the eagerness and ardor with which he was attached to the cause of human happiness and improvement, and the fervent eloquence with which he discussed such subjects. His conversation was marked by its happy abundance, and the beautiful language in which he clothed his poetic ideals and philosophical notions. To deprecate life of its misery and its evil was the ruling passion of his soul. He dedicated to it every power of his mind, every pulsation of his heart. He looked on political freedom as the direct agent to effect the happiness of mankind, and thus any new-sprung hope of liberty inspired a joy and an exultation more intense and wild than he could have felt for any personal advantage. Those who have never experienced the workings of passion on general and unselfish subjects cannot understand this, and it must be difficult of comprehension to the younger generation rising around, since they cannot remember the scorn and hatred with which the partisans of reform were regarded some few years ago, nor the persecutions of which they are exposed. He had been, from youth, the victim of the state of feeling inspired by the reaction of the French Revolution, and believing firmly in the justice and excellence of his views, it cannot be wondered that a nature as sensitive, as impetuous, and as generous as his should put its whole force into the attempt to alleviate for others the evil of those systems from which he had himself suffered. Many advantages attended his birth. He spurned them all when he balanced with what he considered his duties. He was generous to imprudence, devoted to heroism. These characteristics breathe throughout his poetry: the struggle for human weal, the resolution firm to martyrdom, the impetuous pursuit, the glad triumph in good, the determination not to despair. Such were the features that marked those of his works which were regarded with most complacency, as sustained by a lofty subject and useful aim. In addition to these, his poems may be divided into two classes: the purely imaginative, and those which sprang from the emotions of his heart. Among the former may be classified the Witch of Atlas. Adonais, in his latest composition, left imperfect the triumph of life. In the first of these particularly, he gave the reins to his fancy, and luxuriated in every idea as it rose, and all there is that sense of mystery which formed an essential portion of his perception of life, a clinging to the subtler inner spirit rather than to the outward form, a curious metaphysical anatomy of human passion and perception. The second class is, of course, the more popular, as appealing at once to emotions common to us all. Some of these rest on the passions of love, others on grief and despondency, others on the sentiments inspired by natural objects. Shelley's conception of love was exalted, absorbing, allied to all that is purest and noblest in our nature, and warmed by earnest passion. Such it appears when he gave it a voice in verse. Yet he was usually averse to expressing these feelings, except when highly idealized, and many of his more beautiful effusions he had cast aside unfinished, and they were never seen by me until after I had lost them. Others, as for instance Rosalind and Helen, and lines written among the Eugean hills, I found among his papers by chance, and with some difficulty urged him to complete them. There are others, such as the Ode to the Skylark and the Cloud, which, in the opinion of many critics, bear a purer poetical stamp than any other of his productions. They were written as his mind prompted, listening to the caroling of the bird aloft in the azure sky of Italy, or marking the cloud as it sped across the heavens, while he floated in his boat on the Thames. No poet was ever warmed by a more genuine and unforced inspiration. His extreme sensibility gave the intensity of passion to his intellectual pursuits, and rendered his mind keenly alive to every perception of outward objects, as well as to his internal sensations. Such a gift is, among the sad vicissitudes of human life, the disappointments we meet, and the galling sense of our own mistakes and errors fraught with pain. To escape from such, he delivered up his soul to poetry, and felt happy when he sheltered himself from the influence of human sympathies in the wildest regions of fancy. His imagination has been termed too brilliant, his thoughts too subtle. He loved to idealize reality, and this is a taste shared by few. We are willing to have our passing whims exalted into passions, for this gratifies our vanity, but few of us understand or sympathize with the endeavor to ally the love of abstract beauty and the adoration of abstract good. The agalth kai tekalin of the Socratic philosophers, with our sympathies with our kind. In this Shelley resembled Plato, both taking more delight in the abstract and the ideal than in the special and tangible. This did not result from imitation, for it was not till Shelley resided in Italy that he made Plato a study. He then translated his Symposium and his Ion, and the English language boasts of no more brilliant composition than Plato's Praise of Love, translated by Shelley. To return to his own poetry, the luxury of imagination which sought nothing beyond itself, as a child burdens itself with spring flowers, thinking of no use beyond the enjoyment of gathering them, often showing itself in his verses. They will only be appreciated by minds which have resemblance to his own, and the mystic subtlety of many of the thoughts will share the same fate. The metaphysical strain that characterizes much of what he has written was, indeed, the portion of his works to which, apart from those whose scope was to awaken mankind to aspirations for which he had considered the true and good, he was himself particularly attached. There is much, however, that speaks to the many. When he would consent to dismiss these hauntings after the obscure, which, entwined with his nature as they were, he did with difficulty, no poet ever expressed in sweeter, more heart-wrenching, or more passionate verse the gentler or more forcible emotions of the soul. A wise friend once wrote to Shelley, "You are still very young, and in certain essential respects you do not yet sufficiently perceive that you are so." It is seldom that the young know what youth is until they have got beyond its period, and time was not given to him to attain this knowledge. It must be remembered that there is a stamp of such inexperience on all he wrote. He had not yet completed his 29th year when he died. The calm of middle life did not add the seal of virtues which adorn maturity to those generated by the vehement spirit of youth. Through life, also, he was a martyr to ill health, and constant pain wound up his nerves to a pitch of susceptibility that rendered his views of life different from those of a man in the enjoyment of healthy sensations. Perfectly gentle and forbearing in manner, he suffered a good deal of internal irritability, or rather excitement, and his fortitude to bear was almost always on the stretch. And thus, during a short life, he had gone through more experience of sensation than many whose existence is protracted. "If I die tomorrow," he said on the eve of his unanticipated death, "I have lived to be older than my father." The weight of thought and feeling burdened him heavily. You read his sufferings in his agitated frame, while you perceived the mastery he held over them in the animated countenance and brilliant eyes. He died, and the world showed no outward sign, but his influence over mankind, though slow in growth, is fast augmenting. And in the ameliorations that have taken place in the political state of his country, we may trace in part the operation of his arduous struggles. His spirit gathers peace in its new state from the sense that, though late, his exertions were not made in vain, and the progress of liberty he so fondly loved. He died, and his place among those who knew him intimately has never been filled up. He walked beside them like a spirit of good comfort and benefit, to enlighten the darkness of life with irradiations of genius, to cheer it with a sympathy and love. Anyone once attached to Shelley must feel all other affections, however true and fond, as wasted on barren soil in comparison. It is our best consolation to know that such a pure-minded and exalted being was once among us, and now exists where we hope one day to join him. Although the intolerant, in their blindness, poured down amethyst, the spirit of good, who can judge the heart, never rejected him. In the notes appended to the poems, I endeavor to narrate the origin and history of each. The loss of nearly all letters and papers which refer to his early life renders the execution more imperfect than it would have otherwise been. I have, however, the liveliest recollection of all that was done and said during the period of my knowing him. Every impression is as clear as if stamped yesterday, and I have no apprehension of any mistake in my statements as far as they go. In other respects I am indeed incompetent, but I feel the importance of the task and regard it as my most sacred duty. I endeavor to fulfill it in a manner he would himself approve, and hope, in this publication, to lay the first stone of a monument due to Shelley's genius, his sufferings, and his virtues.